Well, good afternoon. I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon as we continue our study in Revelation. Today we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 13. And in this text, if you haven't read it yet, go ahead and pause the video and read it, and then we'll talk about it for a little bit. And so it's a hot day today, and if that doesn't encourage me to be quick with my video and my comments, I don't know what will. I'll try to be short-winded when it comes to this text. So in this chapter, we're introduced to the two beasts of Revelation. In chapter 12, we have the dragon and sort of making war against God's people and even trying to attack Jesus, but it's defeated by the angels. It's cast down to earth. It doesn't stand a chance, and God is going to protect his people, so the dragon is ultimately defeated. However, the dragon is still an agent in the world, and so it doesn't give up on its task. And it says in verse 18, "Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore." So he's next to the sea, and then John is presented with this image of a great beast rising out of the sea that has 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns on the horns. And it's important to note here that there is a difference between the diadem that's described in chapter 13 and the crown of victory that's described as what those who conquer will wear in heaven, or the martyrs will receive. Now, it doesn't matter what tradition you grew up in, whether there's a fly buzzing me, whether you grew up in a tradition that understands Revelation to primarily be speaking about a future sort of end of the world, or whether you grew up in a tradition that understood Revelation to be speaking historically. However, it doesn't matter what tradition you grew up in. The two beasts, the dragon, those are metaphorical images, generally, for whoever's interpreting them. They're not literal beasts that rise up. They are seen to be metaphorical images of beasts, or sort of John sees an image, and that's to be interpreted by futurists as other world powers or other people that might come about, but it's not seen to be as literal beasts and a literal dragon. Rather, it's Satan and his agents that help him. In the same way, the historical interpreter of Revelation doesn't see these as a literal beast and a literal dragon. Rather, they're images that call to mind different things. In particular, we say, John's getting his idea from Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, Daniel's talking about the superpowers, that the beasts are superpowers that oppress Israel and bring them into captivity and enslave them. And the same is said here for those who take a historical approach to Revelation. We're asking the question, what is the metaphor that the first century readers would have understood this beast to be talking about? And then from that, we will go forward with our own approach, or our own understanding of what this text might mean for us today. So there's this 7-headed beast that rises from the sea. And in the Old Testament, the sea was a place of chaos, even a place of evil. But God was a God of order and a God of good, and he often conquers the sea. Jesus stepping out on the waves. If you've been to the ocean and you've ever been in a storm or seen a storm, it can be a chaotic place, especially when you didn't have submarines that could explore the ocean, or divers so you could go down below. If you jumped in the water, you were mainly just kind of swimming on the top, hoping to get to a vessel so that you can float on top. So the seashore was a mysterious, dangerous, chaotic place. And from the seashore, it seems to be at the command of the dragon, there's a beast that rises out of the sea. And he has 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 diadems, which is, as I said earlier, is different from the crowns of victories that the martyrs get. And in many ways, diadems, it's not something that you would have achieved from a game of sort or a competition, whereas the victor's crown would have been. Not a laurel wreath that would be worn, but rather it's a sort of royal crown that's received. It's an imperial crown that might have been worn by Caesars. And one of the keys to understanding what this is talking about, it comes in verse 3. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. So the historical speculation about this is that this head is a reference to Rome, and the other head is a reference to Nero, and the rest of the heads are sort of different Caesars of Rome. And for Nero in particular, there was a legend. Well, Nero committed suicide, and there was a legend going around that Nero actually came back from the dead. And so that was a pretty popular legend at the time. And so verse 3 seems to be appealing to the fact that Nero himself is this head that received a mortal blow but seems to have healed from it, a deadly blow. And then the beast itself is representative of Rome and its power. It says at the end of verse 3, in amazement the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? Now, when it comes to national war rhetoric, generally countries speak of themselves as being very tough. If you engage in sports talk, this kind of conversation happens around different teams that you might like, hockey, baseball, whatever it may be, that there are certain groups or nations or teams that it seems like we'd say, who can stand against this team? They got an all-star cast. Sort of like watching the Olympic NBA American team where there's all these superstars from every team and they're just demolishing the other teams across the world because of how big the NBA is in America. So this beast is very, very powerful. And the beast standing for Rome, that makes sense. The Persians to the east definitely presented a challenge to Rome. But in the first century, or towards the second century, it's thought that Rome could hold its own, especially in Asia Minor. Who can stand against this beast? And it says, the beast was given a mouth for uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. It was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe of people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written down from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. So this beast apparently has total power over the people under its command, and it exercises its authority on everybody who's on earth. And it seems like another thing that points towards this being a reference to Rome is the fact that the Caesars, upon death, were divinized and were considered to be amongst the gods. Now, to the Jewish reader, that's a blasphemic, don't know the right adjective there, but that's blasphemy. For a human to state that they are God, that is blasphemy. And that's why Jesus was sort of killed. In some ideas is because there was some debate as to whether or not he was calling himself actually God. And especially when you read in John, those claims are all throughout. That he's not just saying he's a Messiah, like a prophet or like a king even, but that he is divine. And that's a very offensive thing to say. And that makes sense for the Roman Caesars, that they were making that claim, that they actually are divine agents of the gods, that they themselves will be a god upon their death. And in the case of Domitian, which is a common era for when it's considered this text was written, it may have been after, it may have been before, it doesn't really matter. But Domitian himself, he sort of advanced that claim when he was still alive and stated that he himself, while alive, was a god. And so to the Jewish Christian believer in Asia Minor and in Palestine area, that would have been a very offensive claim to make. It would have been blasphemy. And so in verse 10, it says, "Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints." Endurance and faith of the saints. And then the second beast arises in verse 11 from the earth. And it says it has two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. So it looks nice, but the voice itself is satanic, is what it's saying. It's not from God. It's from the devil. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. So the historic perspective usually points out that this is talking about the imperial cult, that the Caesars made claims to divinity, and there was actually a religious sect of Rome itself that compelled the public to make sacrifices to the Caesars, to engage in worship of the Caesars. And once again, to the Christian and to the Jew, this is not just a blasphemy, but it's a sacrilegious thing to do. To engage in this sort of worship was to, in a sense, abandon faith in Yahweh. And for Christians to abandon the claim that Jesus alone is Lord. So, in this sense, in the imperial cult, they were able to compel folks, and it's thought that Christians often suffered because they wouldn't capitulate to the authorities in this. They wouldn't capitulate to this cult. They wouldn't do the sacrifices. They wouldn't make the offerings to the Caesar, even if that would just let them get by. There was the pressure from the church and from the Jewish, from the synagogue to not do this. And so Rome in general saw this, Christians and Jews, they sort of collapsed them together and said, those are just some hard-headed folks who will cause problems. But Christians were compelled not to engage in this thing. And so, let's see, it says, the beast, starting in verse, my Bible's a little far away from me, and I'm trying to read it. Verse 15, "And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark. That is, the name of the beast or the number of its name." Okay, so essentially what we're seeing here is that those who would not engage in this worship were penalized for it. It says possibly even killed, but if they didn't make these offerings, if they didn't go to the temples to engage in the sacrifices or the festivals, they were penalized from engaging in society. And then it says here, and then it has the number of the beast, which is 666, which in Judaism, there's a sort of second century thing that came about, that Hebrew letters are associated with numbers, and it's called gematria if you want to look it up. But 666 is often thought to be, when Greek is transliterated into Hebrew, and the Hebrew letters are attached to these numbers. The numbers associated with the name of Nero is 666. That's where that comes from. It's not talking about a sort of evil curse that's attached to that number. If you got locker 666 in middle school, that doesn't mean that you're plagued with a curse. What it does mean is that I think it's another indication that this is talking about the imperial cult, the worship of the emperors. It's talking about Rome as an actual entity that is going about the business and ultimately enforcing the will of Satan himself, of the dragon. The beast is going about the business of the dragon. The second beast, those who compel the people to engage in the worship of the first beast are actually engaged in the worship of the dragon. They're going about the business of the dragon. I think that's what that means. Feel free to disagree with me if you want. Revelation is a difficult text. It's a really fun text in a lot of ways, very challenging. But I think that's what this is talking about. I believe it's talking about the Empire of Rome, the Caesars, the Imperial cult, when speaking about the different beasts. Now, what can we take away from this? Now that we have sort of that information, which has been a lot, but now that we have that information, what can we take away from this? In America, generally there's been no penalty associated with being a Christian. Perhaps if you live in a heavily sort of denominational area, if you live in an area where everybody's Lutheran and you are Methodist, that might cause some tension. But generally, there's not been any penalty associated with being a Christian in America. However, and I don't mean to sound like the world is ending. Christians still have it very easy in America, in most parts of America, I think. But it's becoming less and less the standard that people put down Christian on the census. And that never indicated whether somebody was a faithful Christian or not, or whether or not they, what degree would you consider your commitment to Christ? That wasn't ever a part of it. But if you said, you know what, I'm a Christian, that used to be pretty much the norm, especially in our area in Winters, Texas, and it probably still is today. However, that is increasingly and increasingly less so, and I think many of us can feel it, that there's more and more pressure to capitulate as Christians to whatever this world may have for us or want from us. And I think the message of Revelation comes from, is really found there in verse 10. Revelation is about a call for the endurance and faith of the saints in the midst of great persecution and oppression. That there might be significant cultural pressure to not engage in Christian worship. There might be significant cultural pressure to accept certain things that as Christians we cannot accept. In this case, it seems to be talking about that Rome itself, the emperor's claim to divinity. Christians cannot accept that. To state that anybody is divine apart from Christ is blasphemy. And to engage in worship of anybody except for Christ is sacrilegious. And so for Revelation, there was an encouragement: remain distinct. Remember to keep hold of your identity as a disciple of Christ, as a Christian, as a member of God's body, the church. And that is our primary identifier. I think that is absolutely a challenging statement to make, even in a culture where Christianity is the norm. Because oftentimes things sort of slide in under the guise of, well, this is a Christian thing, when at its roots it might be another beast. It might be the work of Satan. God's people are found in the church, and God's people worship Christ and Him alone. No powers of this earth do we worship. We pray for His kingdom to come here on earth as it already is in heaven. We don't pray for somebody else's kingdom to come. It is God's kingdom that will reign, and it is not an earthly kingdom. It is ruled by Christ. And so, as we read about in chapter 12, Satan has already been defeated. He was defeated at the cross, and he awaits his final destination, which is the great pits and the burning lake where he will be destroyed forever and ever. And that has all been taken care of. So whatever significant pressures face you, remember that Christ is Lord and he will not be defeated. God bless you.